Okay, U.S. healthcare costs. In 2010, which is the last year for which we have reliable data, we're 2 years behind on these data, the United States spent $2.6 trillion on healthcare. Now, I have gone to lots and lots and lots of places and talked about this spending. And one of the things I have noticed is no matter where I go, people have a very poor grasp of the word trillion and how big this number is. So we have a few mechanisms to put this in context for you. It's great for cocktail parties or frat parties or any place else you need to talk to someone and raise irrelevant topics and just show how smart you are. So here's the first question for your audience response thing. If you convert healthcare spending, that $2.6 trillion, how many years ago is 2.6 trillion seconds? 40% said 80,000, 100,000, 28%. You guys got it right. It's 80,000 years ago, 2.6 trillion. Do you know how long ago that is? When was the first human that left the African continent, modern human, that left the African continent to explore the rest of the world? They didn't go out exploring. They went out looking for food. That was 60,000 years ago. This is before human beings migrated out of the African continent, and we're measuring this in seconds. So how big is a trillion? Well, 1,000,000 seconds ago was last week. It's about 12 days ago. 1 billion seconds is the year I graduated college. You guys can figure that out for yourself. Okay? And there you go. Got to fix that slide. A trillion seconds is 30,000 BC. 2.6 is around 80,000. All right? Just a huge number. Now, I know seconds is not what you think about, and 80,000 years ago is a little too much in some ways. So, we're going to the moon. Single dollar bills, nice crisp bills gotten right after the Federal Reserve printed them, stacked up. You can see 100 million crisp bills is pretty far, 6.8 miles. $1 bills, right? 100 billion, 68,000 miles. 2.6 trillion, 2/3 of the way to the moon. We're spending that every year on your health care. Just an astounding amount of money. And here's my last comparison. If you look at our healthcare spending in the context of the world GDPs, France is the 5th largest GDP in the world after the United States, China, Japan, Germany, France. Okay? They've got 66 million people. This is their spending on everything. Vacations, education, that good French food, housing, defense, cars. They spend roughly what we spend on everything for 66 million people, what we spend for 300 million people just on healthcare. In other words, if the U.S. healthcare system were a world economy, it's the 5th largest world economy in the world, the 6th largest world economy. Just an amazing amount. If you look at China, you know, we're spending about 40% of the Chinese GDP just on healthcare. We're worried about them taking us over. You know, we should be worried about our healthcare system. Now, it's not just the level we need to worry about. That's very high. But if it weren't moving, we could handle it. It's also how fast it's growing. So, get your audience response clickers out. If healthcare inflation continues at the current rate, which is the rate it's been going for about 30 years, when will 1/3 of the GDP, that's 1 out of every $3 in your wallet, go to healthcare? We need music. We got to do the music. The answer is 2030. Boy, you guys are even more pessimistic than reality. All right, it's 2040 roundabout. It's actually about 2037. And it obviously depends upon healthcare inflation. But that's an astounding number, 1 of every $3. So if you look at this graph, this is how much healthcare is growing, projected based upon the growth in the past. And you can see 16% in 27, going up to nearly 50% in 75 years. Now, we're not going to get to 50%. We'd have a major crisis before we got there. But you can see what impact the growth in Medicare and Medicaid are having. Medicaid, roughly the same, and this is before health care reform. But Medicare, huge increase over that time, and we'll get to why that is shortly. 2009 and 2010. Just 1 year, that's the year for which we have the latest data. Did it rise 300 billion, 200 billion, 100 billion, 50 billion, 25 billion? Now this is all healthcare spending, not just government. So we got a tie, 200 billion to 100 billion. You guys are a little more pessimistic. I must have scared you. It's 100 billion. $100 billion change in 1 year. Now, again, you're not used to thinking about billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars, but $100 billion, that's how much it's costing us to expand healthcare to everyone per year. So if we could have held healthcare inflation at 0 for 1 year, we could pay for the expansion in the healthcare system. Think about $100 billion in almost any other context that you know of. Right? It's a huge amount of money. It's $300 for every man, woman, and child in the United States. We're talking about the payroll tax and all of that. That's less than this level of inflation. Okay? The benefit to a family of 4 of changing that payroll tax is less than just 1 year increase in healthcare costs. Here you have from 1960, 147, this is the per capita spending, so it's controlled for the growth in the population. 1960, we're spending $147. Now it is true this is nominal, so up to, in 2009, $8,000 per person. Again, phenomenal. And then if you look over the decade of the 2000s, you can see going from 5,200 to 8,000. 60% increase in spending. This is the change in each decade, comparing in the green bar the growth in the GDP and the growth in the healthcare. NHE stands for National Health Expenditures, right? First thing you can see is every year, every decade, healthcare expenditures exceed the growth in GDP. There's not a decade-long period where you have healthcare expenditures less than the growth in GDP or equal to the growth in GDP. And you can see in almost every year, here it's 2%, here it's almost 3%, it is 3%. 1990s less, and we'll talk about this in a second. And you can see in this period, 2.5%. Overall, 2.4% for 40 years. Year on, year on. Those of you who have understood the idea of compound interest, that makes it grow, 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 grow on. But I do want to draw your attention. There is 1 year there, 1 year, 1 decade, the 1990s, where it only grew 1.3% above GDP. What was happening, do you think, in the 1990s that did that? Clinton was in power, that's right. So 1993, he takes office in January. He attempts to introduce health care reform and get national health coverage. And what happens? It was defeated. That's right. Lots of reasons why it was defeated, and we'll talk about that on the first session of the ACA, what some of the differences are. But it was defeated. One of the reasons it was defeated was Didn't pass Congress. Yes, that's correct. But that means there wasn't a coalition. Who pulled out of the coalition? Businesses. And they pulled out because they thought they could get a better deal somewhere else. And the thought was, the managed care companies came to them and said, we can hold your costs down. You don't need the government. And the way they were going to do it was with managed care. And then what happened? So one thing that happened is it reduced choice, and Americans rebelled, because at that time, the main mechanism that managed care controlled the costs was to reduce what they paid doctors, but also restrict choices of the population. There was a line going around in the 1990s, 1-800-JUST-SAY-NO. That's what happened. That managed care companies gave you an 800 number if you didn't like their decisions, and all that happened at the other end of that 800 number was just say no. And the consequence was managed care was able to control costs for a short period of time, and we'll see, about 5 years, but then towards the end of the 90s, costs went up, and you can see that in 2000s, that 1.3% graph basically doubled to 2.5% gap in the next decade. Healthcare costs mushroomed. Now this is a somewhat complicated slide, but I've just talked to you about the fact that over 4 decades we've had this big growth. Basically 2.4% above the growth in the GDP in healthcare, taking more and more and more of the GDP into the healthcare arena. This is projected by the Congressional Budget Office into the future. It's not all healthcare spending, it's just federal healthcare spending, which is predominantly what? Medicare, but also has a big portion of Medicaid. And this is to see what happens if there's no excess cost growth. That means if healthcare costs, which they haven't done in 40 years, equal GDP. That solid line here is what happens over basically the next 25 years if healthcare costs do not rise any faster than the growth of GDP. And what do you see? Just interpret the graph. What do you see? It's still growing, right? This is a percent of GDP. Medicare, or the federal portion here, is at about 5%. And you can see it goes over 8%, 8.5% in 25 years. Even if GDP, if it doesn't exceed GDP. If it exceeds GDP by 2%, which is slightly less than what it's been doing in the last 40 years, you can see it balloons past 10, 11%. And if it has slowing growth down to 1.7 percentage points, okay, you can see it still goes over 10%. So the federal budget contribution to healthcare is extremely dependent on how much healthcare grows above GDP. But even if it doesn't grow above GDP, it's going to be a bigger and bigger drag on the federal budget. Okay? This is one reason people who are budget hawks, who worry about the the federal budget, the predominant worry is not Social Security, but health care. We're going to do a few international comparisons so that you get a feel for how our healthcare spending compares to the rest of the world. As a percent, how much more does the U.S. spend on healthcare than the number 2 country in the world? 32%, say 30%, we're a third higher. 32%, say 50%, a quarter, say 40%. Before we get there, who's the next highest country in the world? It's Norway. That's right. They're number 2. And they spend, we are 50% higher than what they spend. Look at this graph. I think this graph is the most important graph in all of health policy. And I'm not lying or exaggerating. Okay? There are at least 2 important lessons to be drawn from this graph. 3 important lessons. So the 3 points of this is we're on another planet when it comes to healthcare spending. This is the characteristic of a luxury good, not a necessity. And we could get down a considerable amount without the necessity for rationing. All right, that's why I think this graph is the most important graph in healthcare policy. I would also say, for those of you who are real nerds, look at these R-squares. You don't get this kind of correlation in any other social science. You just don't. You barely get this in the biological sciences, and you really have to go to physics to get these kind of correlations. The perfect correlation is 1.0. We're spending $7,300 per person in 2007. Corrected, the next highest country, as I mentioned, Norway. Switzerland's number 3, $4,763. Okay? So compared to them, we're 50% higher than they're spending. Now, some people, and I won't get into this today, will say, well, a large part of that is prices. We pay more, so our MRIs cost more. Our doctors, it turns out, have higher salaries than doctors in Europe. Our nurses get paid more. A day in the hospital in the United States is more expensive than a day in France. All true. Doesn't eliminate this gap. Okay? Might reduce it by half, doesn't eliminate it. Plenty of rich, otherwise healthy countries are down below the average. New Zealand, right? Korea, South Korea. Okay, so you don't have to, even Finland is just below. You can be a perfectly fine country and spend a lot less than we're spending. I mean, these are countries spending 1/3 of what we're spending.